what does the lived experience community need to ensure that they don't get caught in a trap?
Are we always talking to the right audiences?
You need seniors, you need
Policy
makers all in the room. The problem that you have with that,
Right.
and then who does that person think they are?
And I'm okay with sharing this. I was never offended, but I know it used to really, really wind you up.
I actually need you to stop doing that.
If I could go back, I don't want to be known for those things.
Was there ever any questions that you were asked in reflection you shouldn't have been asked?
Absolutely. I held them all responsible for this, and I hate to say it, but
I was an absolute nightmare when I was in care.
do they want the how do we solve this?
Yeah, so-
or do they want the story?
Is it okay to name people?
Is this like the Voldemort thing?
I can't mention it, basically.
Welcome to Conversations That Care, the podcast brought to you by the Care Leaders, episode 1, where we explore the power and ethics of sharing lived experiences. I'm Luke Rodgers, and joining me is Karylle Phillips.
How much feedback will you get? Do you know people said that they want to put your laugh as a ringtone?
Ah, Lord.
No, they genuinely do.
All right, I'll give it to the free weight there.
Yeah. How do we start then?
Who are the care leaders? What are they? What do they do?
I suppose it started off with you and I working together, running around the country, talking about our life stories.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Because I think that's really crucial, because I think sometimes when you're in these spaces, especially when you're sharing lived experience, let's just take, I won't mention the social media platforms, but particular social media platforms where we can either have a really big following, and it's not based on numbers, but it can also be based on the people who repost us, the types of people, right? And the positions and the roles that they're in. And it can almost sometimes look for those people who are just starting to share lived experiences about anything. It doesn't have to be care experience. That these are people who are set and are in the scene. And actually, because social media wasn't a thing we were using necessarily before, they didn't see the train journeys of you and I. They didn't see us up and down the country. We weren't vlogging and recording all those moments when we were doing things or walking into situations that were sometimes questionable or doing things for free a lot of the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's talk about lived experience and it being how do you effectively engage lived experience in this space, whether it's training, consultancy, because that's what I see quite a lot. I see a lot of lived experience keynote speakers, I see a lot of people facilitating training, and I see a lot of consultants. So, I think when you and I started doing it, when it was the other organisation that we worked through.
Is this like the Voldemort thing?
Is,
I just started watching it. It's like,
you can't mention it, basically. It was interesting because I suppose we were like a very small number of people that did it.
I don't know. Other than you, I didn't know anybody else. I knew people were doing it because I was in spaces such as service user and carer groups, right, as they were called at the time. And I think in some spaces they still are. And I was in it then, or I was in like children and care councils with other children in care and young people that were sharing their views, but never with the intention that I had to make this a career path.
Well, I don't think it existed as a career path. Because there's only two people, and they won't mind me mentioning them. There was Scott King, and I remember Scott King worked within private and independent fostering agencies. And then there was Ian Thomas, who worked at Core Assets. I think it was FCA at the time.
Yeah.
And then you and I, we just worked with local authorities. So you kind of had this space where Scott was like working in private agencies, IFAs. You had Ian over here working at Core Assets, and then we were at local authorities, and we all stayed in our lane. And there was kind of like nobody else. So there was kind of like just the four of us doing it. And what I thought was fascinating was, it's changed a lot now, and I can go on to why I think it's changed. But the interaction or the exchange I'm really interested in, like, is it okay to be asking somebody external to be sharing their lived experiences? Now, if we think about it, like we got asked to come into local authorities to share our stories. For me, like back then, it was like we were, let's do it. Let's fight. Let's do it. This is exciting. And there's loads of reasons why I think, for me, why I did that.
Why?
Well, there's going to be so many like points to share.
I'm just intrigued.
yeah.
And I think people will want to know, why did you want to do it then? What was the...
Yeah.
Mine was, I thought this was a career path for me.
Yeah.
I genuinely believed I found my niche. I'd finally found something I was good at. I loved the audience reception. I loved people saying, Karylle, that was amazing. Thank you. God, you're so resilient. You say that. And I was like, whoa, I'm starting to build positive skills here.
So I want to take that a level deeper, because that's also what I believed. I think, so I'm going to park the ethics for a second. In reflection now, I'm thinking, why did we need to go in? Because local authorities, number one, should be engaging with their own young people to get these narratives. And two, there is a multitude of information available already from previous consultations, both locally and globally, nationally, everything, you know, where you can actually just read up on stuff that's happened before. So why are we getting other people in to do it? And it's definitely got a benefit. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying let's interrogate it out of interest. For me, at the time I was doing it, was exactly the same reason as you. Number one, I had absolutely zero money, and I had no skills either. So when someone was saying to me, come and share your story on the stage, we're going to pay you to do it, which wasn't always the case.
But
a lot of the times it would be great for your CV. And
I was willing, free food, a day out, travel paid, 100 quid. Couldn't believe my luck.
Well, I felt important, and that's the thing. And I think so then it was like this career path. There was a financial incentive, and as a young person, I always wanted to make a difference. I absolutely challenged the idea of a social worker saying to me, "You need to give something back." Because I was like, "Well, what have you ever given me? You've only taken from me." So like this. What was then interesting is that this came to a head is that I was somewhat working in the space, but I never felt I was giving back. I just felt that I wanted to do good. I realised that sharing a story influenced people, and I was just sharing my life story. As an adult reflecting back now, how I see it personally, and this is from my experience, is that I, up until that point, had had a life where my narrative had been controlled by others. I had no power over that narrative. And like most importantly, I perceived it as completely worthless. Now all of a sudden I'm on a stage.
It's worth your money.
Yeah,
right?
it's worth, well, yeah, I mean, but that aside for a second, like I'm actually now motivating and inspiring people. I can see them being like, wow, you know, and hungry for that knowledge. So it's got this incredible value where it's actually making a difference. And I got caught up in that, I think, because there is a limelight and there is kind of like a wonder to that, where all of a sudden you're being invited around.
It's interesting you use the word limelight, because that's exactly how it felt for me. It felt as though it was the light at the end of the tunnel. I'd been searching and searching and searching. I thought, you know, leaving care was going to be it. I thought, I don't know, whatever options or routes I took was... This felt like the absolute light, because I always used to start when people used to say, "So Karylle, are there any questions we can't ask you?" And I used to be like, "No, I've got no bottom drawer. Ask me anything." To the point where I would be exposing my real childhood traumas. And we're talking about not just the reasons of coming into care and all that parental, familial stuff that was going on, but I'm talking about things that went on in care as well. Some real exposing stuff that actually, if I could go back, and I thought about this sometimes, God, where do those videos exist? You know, where are those things now? Because I don't want to be known for those things. But at the time, I was so okay with it, because in my mind at the time, one, it had all the value that you just spoke about, but two, it was a career path. I was able to make money from this, given that I had no qualifications at the time. I had nothing else. I was told I was absolutely worthless. I was, you know, all these things. And here I am, Karylle.
Qualified teacher, qualified social worker, pow, pow, pow.
Then, here I am, keynote speaking at this conference that I was never ever... And this is the thing I could never wrap my head around, right? I was never invited to these spaces just because, almost like, you know, they do those career days. I think they do them in America, in the UK. It might be things like, I don't know, tell us about somebody in your family or a role model. When I was in care, there was never a moment where somebody would bring me into the other side of care, where they would just bring me to a conference for the sake of it, where I was just invited to learn, to mingle with people, or to learn that these professionals are humans, right? And so here I am in what I already believe is a hugely important people. I now know Not that they're not important, but they're not as
They're just
significant.
people.
They're just people.
Yeah.
But at the time, somebody would just say, that's a team manager. Oh my God. And here I am in this space and I'm keynote speaking for 30 minutes. And all I've got to tell you is how rubbish my life was. It mind boggled me, right? Because I was just like, I can't believe I'm able to do this. And so I genuinely just thought this would be it for me. I'll just go around and I'll do all of this and I'll make money off it. And it's nothing I care about. I don't mind. Everyone knows I was in care anyway.
Yeah.
And then I met you.
But before we go on to that, there's a few points kind of like I wanted to just think about. One was about, you said about videos. And then there was questions. I wanted to ask, was there ever any questions that you were asked that, like, in reflection, you shouldn't have been asked?
Absolutely.
Willing to share?
100%.
Please share.
Childhood trauma,
Yeah.
sexual abuse.
Yeah.
All those things were things that were asked. And they were asked because I did start with that I have no bottom drawer, I'm willing to share. But equally, I was met with people, obviously adults at the time, who would be like, this is a safe space, it's fine, it's for. And I was always told, it's so it doesn't happen to somebody else. And that became my inner drive, right? Because I knew it wasn't going to change anything about my experiences, but I was so driven. It's so interesting, isn't it, that you can go through all of that trauma and yet still hold this huge level of empathy and worry about everybody else. And I think there's a brilliance in this whole resilience around, I am strong, I've been through it, oh my God, I'm amazing. But people forget that with that comes a huge heavy weight of, now I know what's gone on, I need to make sure no other child in care goes through that. And I was constantly in spaces like children in care councils, and all I was thinking is, I wonder if the same thing that happened to me has happened to everybody else in this room. And that's a huge weight to carry because...
Oh, but also like sensitive, like your story isn't going to prevent people from experiencing abuse.
But I thought it would at the time.
Yeah.
I genuinely believe it would.
But yeah, which is
Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. But why I was raising it was because like the person that is saying to you that, they know that that's not the case, because you don't have people in the room that are... And hopefully you don't have people in the room that are abusers. And then number two, is your speech actually going to... Is your speech going to make an abuser go, oh, actually now I've listened to Karylle's story.
What's that?
Do you know what? I'm going to stop
What's
abusing.
that?
Yeah, probably not.
No.
It's fascinating. And I think one of the things that you'd raised as well is about that power dynamic. So I think, again, reflecting back on my experiences, which is what you just shared, one that I had exactly the same of, which was around sort of like adults in social care saying to me, this is what your speech will do, this is the value of it. It's a little bit like what it was like when I was a kid. Social workers and others, teachers, foster carers, people that are in social care saying to me, Luke, this is what you're going to do now.
Yeah.
And so there's this relationship that already exists between my lived experience and that professional experience, and where that professional experience is saying, you're now going to go and do this as a young person in care. Now, as an adult, I've still got somebody that's working in the space saying, now you're going to go and do this because you're in care.
Right.
And I think I had a responsibility as a lived experience leader to actually sever that link, to be like, hang on a minute, I'm just going to reclaim that power.
Yeah. Just because it had me thinking when you're talking about the power. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because on my journey, especially the startings of sharing my lived experience, it was so interesting that the people who I had associated to absolutely ruining my life were now the ones rooting for me. And that was such a weird thing.
Please don't speak about me on the stage. Please don't speak about me on the stage.
And they didn't ever say it, but I noticed my story, my narrative would change when I would share it, right? So I went from absolutely talking about the local authority I was in care with, absolutely talking about they were neighbourhood offices at the time, the different neighbourhood offices and certain social workers and the different fostering organisers, absolutely naming them, right? To when those same people would then call me to come and speak to their carers or their practitioners, to removing names which is fine, right? But knowing that even that power that existed there, it was because for me what was weird was they were able to dissociate themselves from my trauma almost. So I held them all responsible for this, and yet they would pop me up on a stage or in a room and get me to share my experience. as though it wasn't them. And that was such a strange phenomenon for me, because it was like, but it was you guys. And what I realized was, as time went on, they never took what I shared and implemented back into the set, which was so strange. But yet they'd have me at all these events talking, and I can't tell you if the same service or those groups of people in particular ever did anything with it.
That's another one of the challenges, though, isn't it? I mean, my question before I get on to I will say it, like, once you share lived experience, what then? What happens next? And that is one of the learnings that I've got, and what I've kind of like understood and what we do now is that when I share lived experience, which I share lived experience stories, I share the inspirational stories. They're just not mine anymore. They're stories that have been constructed, and therefore I can create a level of detachment from it. So if people are watching this and they're kind of like, oh, well, why doesn't Luke share his story? Because my fear was, when I said I'm not going to share my story anymore, people are going to be like, oh, well, you know, you're done, which is a problem with it, because actually, if your story is your service, and then somebody else comes along and they've got a better story, a more inspirational story, people stop booking you in.
Themed, because there's this thing about it being themed too, and I hate to say it, but I've watched over the years of our journeys separately and together, that it's themed based, and it's almost had me, and I'll be really honest here, at some point going from, no, I'm no longer going there, to, the theme now is, though, CSC. Do I now talk about the stuff? Because I never did it before, but now this is the theme. And so do I go back in there with the whole aim of, because you and I have come to this point over the years of, now what do you do with it? And so all our keynotes, all our training have gone, okay, this happened, but here, the crucial bit, what do we do with this? How do we make a difference, right? It's not just selling our souls almost.
Well, and I think you need three things for it. You've got lived experience, which is stories that then invokes empathy, it creates compassion, it really draws it into real life. You've then got theory and / practice knowledge. So like, what are the theories attached to this? What does this look like in practice? And then the final thing, which is crucial, is evidence-based tools.
Absolutely.
So now that you know the story, you know the theories that sit behind this story, what can you now go and do to support that thing that you've just heard? Which is, I think, like what we do so well at the Care Leaders, and what our experience is through running around the country, talking about life, and then scratching our heads and going, hang on a minute, something just doesn't sit right with me with this. Can
I just add something to what you've just said? Sorry, Luke, because then you've really got me thinking about ACEs. Because again, it goes back to that thing. What if you are, like me, like you to some degree, somebody who has all 10? And
there's actually on that list, there's some that are completely missing for me.
Right.
Whoever's made this list has not experienced adverse child experiences at all. They've scratched their head and gone, I think some people have experienced that. Yeah, just stick it on there.
Go with that.
You know how these decisions are made? It's a group of people sat around the table going, okay, let's just make an ACEs toolkit.
Let's go for it.
Let's just write them. Yeah, there's loads of that are missing, actually.
Loads. Yeah. And we know there are, right, from our own personal lived experiences. But it goes back to children's social care can be so theme driven.
Yeah.
And whilst that's great, I get it. New information, everybody rushes to it. New ideas, it almost, for those lived experience leaders, I guess my advice then would be, for lived experience leaders, would be to, one of the things you taught me was to reframe my narrative, right? And so I went for a stage of exposing everything. Next stage going, what's needed and suited for this environment? How do I give you this so I captivate the audience, right? Because there's a thing there. It's a whole performative issue, right? So this is more than just anyone can get up and talk. Most people can, but you don't have to have had the lived experience to talk, right? There's two folds going on. I've got the experience and I've now learned how to speak to an audience and how to deliver that and how to make it creative and informative and all these things around it. To then being in a stage where, but I want to come away from that now, and I just want to be seen for all the things I actually do know and the research that I've got, or the qualifications that I've gone on to have. But whilst equally for those lived experience leaders who are in this part of it's just their one experience, so to speak, or a few experiences that are themed based, the whole ACEs research, what we know about it, and the 10 ACEs, it fails to recognise that if we know most children and young people in those experiences may have faced so many or more, then just to define yourself as only care experience. So I tried to do it where, yes, I'm care experience, but...
Yeah, so it's... But what was your but? That's
My
what I'm
but that
interested in.
would, I had to go to uni, I had to go to college, because I found I was just here. I just kept getting stuck. It became about, okay, Karylle, so we want you to come and talk, but yes, we want to share your experiences, but we also want to ask a key topic right now. And I'd be like, in order for me to speak on that ethically, so it goes back to your earlier point about ethics that we said we'd put aside, I had to know what I was talking about, because yes, I can do the lived experience thing all day long, but then I met other people whose lived experience was different, whose lived experience didn't look like that, who didn't go down that route, and who entered care later on, or all these things I didn't know. And then the theory and the law and the realities of the system behind it.
Because I think like it's an interesting chat, isn't it? Really, like what does it look like engaging lived experience in this space? I think. I mean, there's a thing that I consider in that way is like story jousting. There's a few things that I noticed in our community, which I try and stay very much away from. Is that like I suppose if a story is a service, which is essentially what we're looking at here, and you've got these individuals that are sharing their stories, which now there are many. Like I said at the start, there was just the four of us. Yeah. I think, 2016, after we worked on the innovation program for government, part of our work then, made those projects require to actually communicate how they were going to co-design. It was when the word co-design started to come across, because you and I obviously, worked so hard to make that happen. At the same time, social media's influencer kind of like concept started to develop. So you've got this government-led initiative to say, projects that need money need to co-design with those that have got experience. And you and I were working heavily in that space, whilst at the same time you've got influencer marketing happening on social media. All of a sudden, since 2016, I saw this rise of people on the internet, on social media, being like, I'm a lived experience facilitator.
Which is brilliant, but on that career pathway we're talking about, right? We're not just talking about people just started talking about their lived experience. That's brilliant, and that was happening. We're talking about where it became a service, though, right?
Well, worth saying, actually, just for a bit of a laugh, that obviously the people that are watching this will be like, where have these workbooks just come from? All of a sudden. They'll be like, they weren't with them a second ago, they've just popped on the table. It's worth saying, like, we have actually just paused to get these workbooks. Oh God, that's probably a very important document as well. Yeah, just so anybody watching this, just saying the care leaders are not magicians. What I would like to talk about.
Come on then, we're serious now.
When you're filmed or when you've got consultations, research, got your lived experience, for me, that stuff gets recorded, it's then kept, it is then shared. So let's just say the example is you've done a keynote speech, it's been recorded, of which I and you have done many times, of which you and I have done many times, is the right way to say that. Like, where does that go? And my fear in that space is that we don't consider what that looks like in the future when, let's just say, from my experiences, I would talk about things that I wouldn't talk about now. And I've watched some of my videos back from when I was like in my early 20s, and like my toes curl.
Slime.
Toes curl. Yeah, going back to one of your original points as well about naming people, I suppose question is like, is it okay to name people? And I learnt this the hard way. So I named one person quite frequently who made, and I still stand by it to this day, a very bad decision. And they also know they've made a very bad decision because we spoke about it, which is what I'm just about to tell you. So I was running around sharing this story. I said, this person said this, and therefore this happened. And I said it because I was like, this is shocking. And people need to know how shocking this is. I don't actually know what I was actually trying to say or trying to get people to learn.
Right, okay.
Which, again, we'll talk about my reflections now as why I spoke about these things. But then I went to a conference and they were there and I mentioned them. And then I remember at the buffet, and it was like a bit later in my career. So like I was maybe like 24, 25. So I've been doing it for a few years. And in the corner of my eye, there's this person who I completely didn't recognize. And I'm getting buffet food, I'm having a laugh, I'm having a joke with people around me. And then this really sheepish person comes up to me and says, like, this is my name. And I was like, oh gosh. And I remember just this guilt because what I'd seen in front of me was like somebody
Human.
and with deep remorse. I don't know what was going on in their life. I was an absolute nightmare when I was in care. And I would challenge and push people to the high heavens. And then now all of a sudden I'm running around the country naming this person, shaming this person. And from that point on, I never did it again because I was like, actually, that's just not okay. And, you know, who sense checks us, I suppose, is the question. Because that needs to happen.
That does.
For so many reasons. Number one is because, like, if I'm sharing trauma on stage, number one, which that story was traumatic, but there's layers to this. Am I traumatizing my audience? Number two, if I'm naming somebody, like, that's not okay to do. Like, and to really shame somebody without context, because it actually counteracts what I'm actually saying. I'm saying, don't judge me on my behavior. Look at what's behind it. Yet what I was doing was saying, this person has done this thing bad. And then, you know, that's just not okay. And it's not helpful, like, to actually then get a system to change based on blame and making people feel guilty.
And I think it's a really good point, Luke, actually, because one of the things I was thinking about when we first started talking was you and I in those different stages, right? And who we started off as, who we became to be, and then so forth. And I think there's a few things that are going on here. One, it's great that we're able to still have this reflective space to talk about some of those lessons learned that we can give to lived experience leaders and other people who are actively recruiting lived experience. Well, you've seen I've posted a few jobs that have requested in its job title lived experience. But I've also caveated that where possible and ensured that I've said, hopefully to those who are sharing jobs or recruiting, I hope this comes with a level of support, because it's great that we're now considering lived experience and we're saying it and we're open to it. But it's what then does that look like? How do I get protected in my trauma? Because we never know when it's going to be re-triggered. We never know when we're going to be re-traumatized. But what's really key about you naming people or talking about that part is, you're right, it's redundant, right? When we then talk about blaming and shaming people, because the reality of what we know it now, right? Because we have to give ourselves some grace. We didn't know then what we know now. And what we know now is there are some brilliant, brilliant, special people that exist within this system. But the system doesn't allow for that. The system doesn't always allow for those brilliant people to shine, and doesn't always allow for those brilliant people to be innovative. No matter how much we say, if you just do this and do that, it will all work out. The reality is, within that system though, let's take one of your videos where you speak about your case file and the realities of it. And so I've seen that show up in different trainings. So I've texted you at the time, and I'm like, you're not good.
It's been pulled down now.
There's another one. I'll give you the link. But anyway, there's another one.
People are hungry. Like, give me lived experience.
Want it. And it's quite an old video, but the key message is you've always been really good at that, right? Which are brilliant. And practitioners who I know that watch the video now love that. But I always do say, because it's about case recording, it's about Luke is, but this was the reality, and that context not being there. And one of the things I do say to practitioners when they watch that video is, I don't believe the person who wrote your initial case file, so I'm glad we're getting to say this, I can say this to you, intended to cause Luke harm. I don't believe they sat there and went, do you know what I'll do? I won't put any context to it. I'll just write terrible things. And whilst the language being used wasn't great, the system will only ask a question. Is Luke high risk? It doesn't always allow for, but hold on. He's not, because actually the context is this. It just says, is he yes or no? Is he at risk of? Is he? And when that information's pulled down, sometimes it ends up in this. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute your or I files at the time were written in the way that we now know they should be written, right? Because we've got people just throwing information in and it's all getting pulled out. But the whole naming and blaming and that person is, we can forget sometimes that they're working within a system that isn't trauma informed. They're working within a system that, whilst the same service will be advocating heavily on lived experience and promoting that, they're not systemically changing the system based on the lessons that are being shared. And so these people are still stuck within that system.
So there's a blind spot, essentially, when we're looking at engaging lived experience. And if we use that example, So and that video, obviously, of course, social care is resourceful enough to find another video of me online, which takes us back to our points of videos. But let's just, you've got lived experience people talking about their case notes and recording in that circumstance where not everybody, but some of them don't understand what you just explained. That actually the prompts that are being asked to adults, professionals, that then elicit a response.
Good intended, trauma informed, youth focused.
Yeah. So the questions, are like, explain risk. Analyze risk for me. So you've got professionals that are governed by a system that is prompting them to ask questions that are going to lead certain answers. So that's the system.
Yeah.
Now, lots of people that have got lived experience they don't understand that system because they've not been exposed to it. Doesn't mean they can't understand it. So they go around and say, this is all of the bad things that have been recorded about me, and then they share it.
Yeah.
But then again, for me, it's then what do you do with that? Because then what needs to happen is the call to action then is, let's review these systems. Let's actually analyse the biases in these particular prompts and to see if they're leading. And if they are leading and need to lead, because sometimes they might you need to talk about risk, then how do you balance that with
And so my thing will go back to, are we, as lived experience leaders, are we always talking to the right audiences? Because there's this thing, right, where we can, you and I, I'll just speak on you and I, where we get caught up in the, let's tell foster carers, let's tell social workers, let's tell all the professionals that could possibly come into contact with a looked after child. But respectfully, no matter how much when we think about how significant the power that those groups of people hold, the power to change systems is not within their reach. Right. And so whilst that's great and they'll feel it, they'll hear it, they'll change practice, they'll think about it, we still aren't sat with the people. So I'll talk about a personal experience in terms of a work-related one. So I was the named person for looked after children and would have to write PEPs, personal education plans. And, I tried to be in hope, and I'm confident that all the people I came into contact with, practitioners, children, young people, mine were as child-focused as possible, and the work that I would do within education meant that they were looked after well, in terms of the system stuff. I found myself fighting systems a lot. But one of the things that always comes to mind, and other people have heard other speakers speak on this, is the on track to pass or not on track. And that was always something. So here I am, Karylle, as you know me, with all that lived experience of care, with all that knowledge now, with all that, and the system's asking me, is this child or young person on track? And my thing inside is, they're here, they're alive, they're doing well. But the process or the format is saying, and what does attendance look like? Okay, doesn't look great, but they come and see me every day. The form doesn't see all the brilliant social skills and developments they're making, because all it's tracking is education, and it's tracking education not based on potential, not based on interest, not based on possible outcomes, hopeful outcomes. It's based on those ACEs. It's based on research that has said, if this isn't happening at this time and stage, the worst things will happen. And I know, and you know that's not true, because we can be all those worst things that could happen and then boom, we change the system, right? But the research doesn't follow us to that part. It only follows you to this, the doom and gloom, the bad bit. And so for these children and young people, I used to really struggle, because then I'd be faced with answering to people who go, but Karylle, if their attendance is this, this is the behaviour policy. Karylle, if their attendance is not that, they can't have. Karylle, if they're not. And my thing, selfishly, was, I don't care if they're not coming here to get an education. They're coming here and I'm a safe person for them, and this is a safe space, and there are other safe people here for them. And, I was luckily working with some brilliant people who felt that too, but the system didn't look like that. So when they get their case recording, because they might forget about the Karylles and all the other people around them, they'll get it and it will say, not on track, did not achieve, didn't get the target, didn't meet goals. It will just be quite negative in terms of what their life looked like. And especially given when you're living those experiences, as much as I consider myself to be a beautiful, amazing, inspirational person, they'll forget about Karylle. And that's the plan, right? The plan isn't that they remember me. they forget, but they'll remember, or they'll try and remember what their time was like, and it'll just all be negative when they read it.
Yeah. Well, that's about when you look at relationships, I suppose, the times, well, there is the immeasurables, which is what I'm hearing. I suppose social care and school, they have their own measurements, and school being attendance, social care maybe being attendance to a review. And sometimes they compete with each other.
Right.
And also the time of the measurement ends at 18 years old. And so we are measuring young people in the hardest time of their lives, under their most stress, and we're saying that this is how they're going to achieve, or this is the expectation of achievement.
That they're not meeting.
Yeah, they're not meeting the relevant expectations because they're falling behind in compared to their peers who are not under severe stress, who are not living away from their families, and who have got a nice support network. So, and then we stop that recording at 18 years old when they turn independent, and then they live their lives, and they end up, a lot of them, in situations just like you and I. Not everybody, but that's what happens with lots of situations.
But these group of children and young people, sorry to cut you, become those that are cherry-picked for lived experience sharing. That they become those that then share their experiences. So when we go back to talking about, well, what should people be doing in terms of sense check-in? How are we supporting children, young people, and the future lived experience leaders in those experiences? Because we don't want to remove that is your lived experience, and we don't want to take away from that. Actually, you've got evidence that that's what people wrote about you. But how are we managing that for them and for everybody else? Because otherwise, where's the hope in that? How do practitioners hear there's something I can do? I've met some brilliant people along the way and still know them now who are just like, tell me and I'll do it. I just need to be told, and I'll go off and I'll do it. Because if it's not something in their reality, they don't know how to change it. But it's unfortunately never the people who can change it that are saying that. This whole, the lived experience conversations, and when the people who say, Karylle, you're so amazing, you're so inspirational, it wasn't a hard sell to them because they're brilliant people anyway. They already got it. My story sometimes just confirmed what they knew. It's those people in positions that can make the change, that aren't always in the spaces where I'm talking, that aren't always sat on my training, that aren't there,
But then, so you need to have directors, you need seniors, you need policy makers all in the room listening to these narratives that we're talking about. The problem that you have with that is unless that narrative communicates clear action, then all of those people are kind of like, we hear this all of the time. Yeah, we know these stories, right? Which is not to devalue the story. But actually what I think is, when we're talking about engaging lived experience into this space, is that lived experience individuals, they need skills and they need knowledge. And one of those knowledge bases is, like, what are the systems at play? So they can actually communicate and say, this is actually what you need to be doing as directors, as seniors, of all that kind of stuff. But we don't give them the time to actually learn that. We just go, come and share your story, come and do your piece.
Because it touched me. Oh, I've heard it and it was amazing.
Yeah.
Do you remember a time, just to share with everyone, and I'm okay with sharing this, I was never offended, but I know it used to really, really wind you up, that when we...
I think you're about to say something and you've not seen it yet, but I've literally just written a blog about this exact thing. And I hope it is exactly what you're about to say.
Probably is going to be, right? So when you and I started the Voldemort journey, right? And we realised, so Luke and I got together and we said, do you know what? This is great. I'm glad we were both in this space and we're the best people for it. And that space, just for people who are listening who don't know, we were creating a bespoke curriculum for social work students, both at BA and MA, around the lived experience of children in care, and giving them one of the first opportunities to do a live looked after child review with Luke and I in the review, right? So we would have people playing our mums. It was this whole thing, right?
I remember all of that.
Woo! Yeah. And it was brilliant and it was innovative and the students got so much from it.
The role play,
But in terms of the support that came after, I used to feel quite heavy. I don't know about you, but when I'd leave and I'd be like, God, if those group of people were my social workers in that situation, my life would have been so much better. And that can be quite powerful in and of itself. But anyway, I digress. So you and I had met there, and then we realised at that point, these types of things were needed in other spaces, and how we could do that ethically, authentically, as much as possible. And so we started the journey. And so then we'd start getting calls in for work. And we had a website, we had all these things. Luke and I had done these amazing things together. And every time the call would come in, it would be like, can we get Luke?
We don't want you, yeah. Yes. Carry on, because I've cut you.
No.
Because I've just, again, I think this is an issue, again, when you're engaging with lived experience. Is like, who decides the value of a story? Because, and how I've written this in the blog is, number one, what I've said is that what I learnt about you and what I appreciate about you is your compassion, your understanding of that whole thing, and then my fury towards it. I was like, one of the things that I appreciate about Karylle, when the phone or the email came in, and I wasn't available on that day, so we're like, oh, Karylle can do this. We're like, we don't want Karylle, we want you. How you would actually just really deal with that in such a balanced way. And I'm always interested in like really what that was like for you. Then like, who does that person think they are to then actually say that kind of stuff? Because what does that do? And like, that's the thing about, I appreciate how you dealt with that, because I suppose we were able to look at that really in an interesting way.
I'll tell you how I balanced it and always kept on to was, and we'll talk about this, I imagine, in another series or another podcast, but there are huge differences between you and I. And whilst you and I never saw them because we connected on. So I used to tell everybody that Luke was my foster brother, although we never lived in any of the same place. We didn't even live in the same part of the country. Because for me, we lived in care together. That was it. We were connected by that. And for me, that was enough. That outweighed the fact that you were a white man. That outweighed the fact that I was a black woman. That outweighed the fact that you were Northern and I was from the Midlands. It outweighed everything for me because that was so powerful. That similarity, that experience, that trauma, that all of that was enough to outsee everything else. And so when people would want you, I was like, it's okay because it's Luke sharing the story. So, brilliant. One of us is in the room. At least one of us is in the space. But equally, it just goes to show, and again, I know we'll talk about this as we go forward, just the disparities between lived experience leaders, even if you just think about them. You know, when you said earlier, we only knew of you and I, Ian and Scott. Apart from me, you, Ian and Scott seem quite similar in so many, you know? And so when we think about that, and it's not that your experiences are the same, but we think about how are we even getting into the room?
Well, how are we perceived? I mean, what do you represent? Again, what I'd written in the blog, I was like, part of this from my reflections was, is this a white man? Is this a black woman situation where you've got like people saying actually, which I don't actually think is intentional, but there's definitely unconscious biases.
Absolutely.
And
the audience. Let's think about how social care is made up. We know how it's made up. We know it's disproportionate in terms of, we know there are huge recruitment drives to get more black adoptive carers, more black foster carers, more black, and yet...
But so the argument, I mean, because that's like in this blog, I was like, this is the and there's all sorts to like communicate into that space, especially when we look at things like protected characteristics, which we're going to talk about in a later episode. But like for me, if you look at this in the bigger sphere now, there's more of us doing this. At the time it was you and I, that came in, I would lose my absolute shit. You would be then calming me down, which was another thing. So I'd be like, and I remember just as a like, what I want us to talk about in a second is like, what can people do, tips and things like that. I remember what I used to do was cancel my speech like a couple of days just before.
So they
for a problem that wasn't a problem, and then send you or say, do you want to go and do this? And it was like, Karylle, I'm going to cancel it. The client's really angry. I've told them that it's, or I'd cancel it on the day, and I'd say, don't worry, Karylle's going to be there, because I was like, I wanted to force people to see you because. One, you are a significant. The difference between you and I
know what you're about to say, and Luke always says this.
What?
In terms of you put me. Go on.
No, you share now.
Because you always used to say to me at the time, and because bearing in mind, I had completed my social work qualification,
Yeah.
I had done all these things, I had worked in fostering,
Yeah.
and Luke used to be sitting there going, but hold on. Yes, she's got that lived experience story and we both got one, but she's got this in addition and you lot don't want
This
that.
is how well you and I know each other. I can't wait for you to read this one because that's what I was like. I was like, okay, so you enjoyed the stage less than I did,
Yeah.
but you were
Yeah.
a fantastic facilitator,
Yeah.
which is, I remember like we would go into spaces. I remember like once we were facilitating this thing with young people and there's like a young person chatting at the back. So I start chatting with him and we're having a good laugh and all this kind of stuff. And I thought I was doing good because I was engaging. But it was your session and I remember you pulling me to one side afterwards and being like, what you just did there is you enabled that whole thing from happening. So I actually need you to stop doing that. And I was like, what? He was enjoying it. Yeah, he was enjoying it, but he was distracting everybody in the class.
Yeah.
And then I was immediately plummeted back to the teacher and young Luke relationship that I used to have as a child, where my teacher was like, you're the class clown.
Stop it.
But yeah, like
Yeah.
people were like, you were a qualified, at the time you were a qualified social worker, you were just becoming a qualified teacher. And I'm kind of like, hang on a minute, not only do you have lived experience, not only are you a phenomenal presenter, facilitator, significantly better facilitator than I was,
Well, thank you.
hands down. I mean, I was your ride or die for that every single time. And you had like these qualifications, but people were like, we want Luke. And
Which goes back to why.
Yeah.
Why are people calling lived experience? Do they want the how do we solve this?
yeah. So
Or do they want the story?
yeah, so just to kind of build on it for a I don't know actually, but I suppose like the big thing there is like, what does that do now there's more of us? Because my fear is when you say that you are an inspirational speaker, which I think in itself, the language around it makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But then, okay, so your service is your story. Now your whole livelihood is built on your story.
Yeah.
Your whole business is built on your
Yeah.
story. The next, and everybody's now popping up all of the time. There's more, all of a sudden a new person comes along.
And they'd right.
And they're now the person doing it, and you no longer get any bookings.
We don't talk about that, you know.
Yeah, no, we don't, because there's two things that happen. One, if you've got a mortgage or anything, whatever, like your livelihood is now at risk. But two, I think deeper, the thing that we miss is that you're now living in the shadow of somebody else's story, and the world is saying to you that story is now more
Done.
important.
We've
than you.
moved on.
Yeah, so
We moved on from that, Karylle and Luke.
Yeah.
Instead, now we want this. And so luckily you and I were skilled enough to reframe all of that and create a business.
So that's where I want to go. That's where, because I wanted to sort of spend sort of maybe 10 minutes to sort of close this podcast off to think about, like, what does the lived experience community need to ensure that they don't get caught in a trap, that if they, that their story is their only service. I suppose, let me rephrase that. So, so what does our lived experience community need? So their service isn't just their story, because at some point that story will come to an end. And what I'm seeing now is the rise of lived experience speakers. So because there's going to be so much choice, it's no longer going to be a small number of people. It's going to be this diverse platform, which is what it should be. Absolutely. But then, so what does our community need, I suppose, is maybe a question I just want to throw out there.
What it needs is, I don't understand, given how far we've come, and you and I have been in this for a long time now, why there aren't within each local authority, council, organisation, people who are able to predominantly recruit or resource lived experiences, and that person is lived experience. Because one of the things that kept you and I going, and I don't know if everybody knows this, is we both held jobs within this, right? And so our roles were still within either local authority or some type of role within social work or children's social care. And that's key. So we both had you had a very supportive local authority where you came from. So they kept you in and put you in spaces. So whilst it wasn't full-time work, it kept you going whilst you were looking and exploring that lived experience route. And for me, I was working full-time, either as a social work lecturer or in fostering and children's rights. And so it meant everything you and I did in the sphere together. And whilst it, like I said, we haven't got any videos of it in that regard, but we were touring this country at one point. We were in so many local authorities doing things that were outside of just lived experience talking or keynoting. And people don't know that we're responsible for some huge national consultations. We're responsible for being involved in some huge government-led initiatives. We're responsible for changing certain services in terms of but we weren't speaking on stage. And so people weren't able to see that, or our names weren't written on the paper, or all of that kind of stuff. And so my advice would be, that's brilliant that you're getting invited everywhere, and use that, utilize it, get your name out there. But what is your thing? Your unique selling point was something. I had a mentor when I really was taking this as a career, right? I had a mentor and I'd gone through the whole Prince's Trust business. Like, this was a serious thing for me. This wasn't just get a phone call, get called. This was a website, design, all of that. And my mentor at the time, who was absolutely brilliant, said to me, Karylle, your story's great. He was so straight up. Your story's great, but what's your unique selling point? And I was like, me, Karylle? No. What is it? And then it made me really think about, well, actually, hear what I'm good at. I'm good at storytelling. I'm good at performative stuff, but I'm also brilliant at creating resources. I'm brilliant at creating training that I can put my lived experience into a sellable product that has a longer impact and on a large group of people, that I can create bespoke ways using my lived experience, using my social work knowledge to go, I get how the system looks, but here's my experience. This is the work I've done with you and I, the consultations with young people, and this is the landscape. Let's do this. And so that's what I focused on. So my thing would be utilize the spaces you're in and get employed there. Ask them. So that's who do you have right now recruiting? Who do you have right now looking at policy and procedure? Ask for the door to be open for you, because why not?
So because I 100% agree, and I think there's a few things in what you've said. So number one is to employ people that have got lived experience. I think locally as well, like employ people from a local space so that you can actually so this is not having a children in care council, a leaving care forum. This is actually employing people to act as the representatives of those spaces. So that's thing number one. But then number two, once they're employed, give them appropriate skills and give them appropriate challenge.
Knowledge, absolutely.
Say to them, and this is the thing, we kind of tiptoe around lived experience, but saying to them, I recognise that your story is impactful, it moves people, it inspires people, but what actually is it you want them to do with it? What is it you're actually trying to sell them? What is the call to action? And I think that we need, therefore, then good mentorship, like what you're saying, actually, if we're going to employ people, if we're going to give them skills, then whoever supervises them needs to have some really good training and some really good clear messages to say, what we want you to do is be radically honest with this person, show unconditional welcome with this person, and essentially give them the skills, but just challenge them and support them. High challenge and support is what we would say.
And one of my key things to lived experience leaders would be, don't be afraid of coming out the spotlight. I think that is one of the, and I say that as though we're celebrities. I don't mean it in that way. I mean it as
well. The care space at the moment is very sexy. Everybody wants to be in the care space, and if you're
feel really
because everybody, but if you think about it, it's doom and gloom a lot of the time. So all of a sudden you've got this story that's like, everyone's like, oh,
they survived.
This is great, and so you kind of end up having this. It does feel very much like.
And you get called all the time. People are reposting you. You get millions of comments. You're getting that celebrity status. And so
it's somewhat,
My thing would just be, you've got to be willing to move from that. And you and I did that brilliantly in the shadows when we were working on all these other things and building our knowledge base up. And now here we are back again now in this virtual space where we are sharing our experiences and we are sharing our lessons learned. But you've really got to be willing to say, what is 12 months outside of this limelight to go build that to next? Come back stronger. But it's scary, right? And it is scary because the thing you just mentioned, as you said, was then the next theme comes and the next person comes. And it's not about being fearful of the next person. So my tip then would be to those services, invest. Invest in the lived experience leaders that that are local to you. Invest in them. And I don't just mean for one-off keynote speech or a little bit of training, because that's all nice, but it's not huge out. Invest in them,
So-
employ them in some way, give them a role, and expand their business with them. So what you know about the care leaders for
Well, that's we're like in sync, literally. Like,
I mean,
yeah,
come on,
we're like
aren't
literally,
we?
like, because that's what I was going to say. I think there is like to sort of like a few points to kind of just raise. There is like entrepreneurial skills exist within our community.
Absolutely.
Heavily, and I think more so than other communities,
Absolutely.
because care experienced people have had to be resourceful growing up. So these kind of limited opportunities of share your story for me, I think we need to interrogate more.
Yeah.
And we've developed something that says, essentially, so some messaging that says, stop investing in stories and start investing in ideas.
Ooh.
And it's the idea is that, you know, I suppose our career trajectory is that we got on the stage, we shared our stories, we shared our ideas, and somebody was brave/stupid enough to say, hey, come along. And we had these great mentors that taught us this stuff. And I suppose that's what the Care Leaders Fellowship is, and the concept of going from care leaver to care leader, because that's where I see it now, is that your care leaver, your lived experience story, it is like a pathway. This pathway doesn't exist yet. I think this is what we're trying to forge at the Care Leaders. And then moves you to this other space, which is this entrepreneurial care leader. And that's what we're saying to local authorities now. We're saying to local authorities, you'll have individuals that have got incredible ideas in your local authorities. Send them to the Care Leaders Fellowship, and we'll give them the tools to turn those ideas into businesses, projects, and ideas.
Right.
And, you know, we've just supported 14 people to do it very successfully. So that we need a lot more investment, I think, in this area. We need to stop seeing it just as stories and start investing in ideas.
And one-off.
Yeah, we need to actually really interrogate the ethics around whether or not it's okay to be asking people. We need to start asking our questions on the value proposition. How do we value the difference between these speakers? Is it okay to select one and not the other?
I do see there are, because I do just want to give nod to, there are some local authorities, and within that local authority, the different services that are doing that seemingly well. It appears that some of the lived experience leaders that I'm following online, in particular, they are what seems to be supported by their local authorities. Now, these might not have been the local authorities they was in care with, but they're the local authorities that have had them as guest speakers and continue to. Every time I see it, they're now running a project with that local authority. And that's what we're talking about here. It's that investment that even if this experience comes to an end at some point, and it's 12 months, 2 years, whatever, that each of those lived experience leaders had the opportunity, have had the support, have built and grounded more knowledge so they can go off and do whatever they might do in future. And so their story isn't just the only thing they can lead with, that actually they can go into other areas of the sector very easily.
Yeah. And I suppose like what you're saying there is if they're investing in their people, their ideas, your local authority can act as like maybe a pilot to try your idea, and then you can start to roll that out on a national, local level. Yeah. Excellent. So let's, is there any kind of like final things you want to say about like final tip, final point about what it is like to engage lived experience into this space?
Just don't stop doing it, no matter how much it can seem or appear online that the sector is becoming consumed with lived experience. It's because we've never had this opportunity. And so allow it, let it grow, let it flourish. Because my thing is these lived experience leaders go on to become, right? And if they are in positions like that and they know the services well, they will encourage the next group of children, young people with lived experience, and it can only be for the good reason, right? Because everything so far hasn't worked. And I say it hasn't worked, hasn't changed outcomes necessarily. It's changed the dial slightly sometimes, but it hasn't changed those core hard-hitting ones. And so if we're investing more, if we know what we know, which is the outcomes might still be this, and we have no control of the whole system because we're one person, but if we invest in our children and young people, what we can say is hopefully at that point, we can invest so much into them as adults that they become the people who can make those changes. So yeah, let it flourish, let it grow. I hope more lived experience leaders get doors opened for them, On that
note, we'll bring this podcast to a close. Unfortunately, this podcast was not sponsored by anybody, so we don't have to mention any sponsors at the end of this podcast.
We've got no labels.
We've got no
really.
labels. It was just a great chat with Karylle and Luke, and thank you everybody for listening.